So can I start?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you, Mas Pri, and also the participants of this UCREL series, and also the UCREL team for giving us the opportunity to present this research on voice alternation and the meaning preserving hypothesis in voice alternations. So I cannot play the slides because of some issues, so I will just move around from this table of content here. So the first part will discuss what is meant by meaning preserving hypothesis in voice alternation. And in the second part, I will discuss previous works that motivate our aims, that underlie our research question, and also motivate our approach to use the usage-based approach to look at this hypothesis, and I will discuss how we gather the data and also the methods that we use to analyze them. And I will present the results and discuss the implication and also the summary of voice alternation, especially between active and passive, is considered as a meaning-preserving alternation. This means that the passive clause and the active clause of the same verb should convey the same meaning. So the alternation from active into passive preserve the meaning of the verb. So that's technically what is meant by meaning preserving. So if we look at these two examples here, example 1 and example 2, the base verb here is kenakan. In Indonesian, that one of its senses is to wear clothing, okay? And in example 1, it is the active form of this verb, kenakan. And in example 2, it is the passive form of the kenakan. And these two examples convey the same senses of kenakan, namely wearing. The difference in this, active and passive voice is only the alignment between which semantic roles fill the subject argument of the verb. So in example 1, in the active, it is the actor that is the subject, while in the passive, it is the undergoer or the non-agent argument that is selected as the subject. Okay, so let's look at another example from the domain of time based on motion verbs in Indonesian. Here are two other examples now using different verbs, namely majukan, the target verbs, one of the target verbs that we discussed in this presentation. So here, again, active voice, passive voice. Here is used to convey the temporal sense of causing an event or a time or a schedule to happen earlier. And in example 3, it is the education department of Surabaya City that acts as the actor, while in the passive, the actor is suppressed, but only leaving the undergoer argument, namely the event, in this case, exhibition matters. This is a typo, I'm sorry. So as a note, Indonesian does not only have the active-passive opposition, but it also has the so-called undergoer voice concept. Really also becomes the feature of voice system in Austronesian languages. So it is part of the so-called symmetrical voice system. And undergoer voice is morphologically unmarked on the verb, okay? Just like passive, undergoer voice also puts the undergoer argument in the subject position. So it's like passive, but unlike passive, the actor argument of this undergoer voice is still a core argument. It's not omitted, it's not demoted. And with that situation, so undergoer voice is syntactically transitive because it has two core arguments, and that also differentiates this undergoer voice with the true passive as in English. Okay, so we didn't look at the undergoer voice because for the verbs that we study, it occurs in a very low frequency compared to the morphologically marked active and passive before. Right, so we only focus on the active and passive that is marked morphologically. Now, I would like to discuss the broader context where this study fit, and that also motivates our work here. The first part is the rich research tradition in voice system and voice selection in Austronesian languages, especially from quantitative discourse perspective. And it is typically within the Hopper and Thompson's discourse transitivity framework. And one of the aims of these studies, discourse approach to voice selections, is to determine the typological alignment of Austronesian language, whether it follows the ergative or accusative patterns. Like Fei Wook's studies here in 1996, she looked at or investigate the discourse ergativity hypothesis on Jakarta, Indonesia. Okay, so that's the first broader context. The second one is construction grammar, where there is a growing interest in construction grammar to look at interaction between different senses or non-metaphoric and metaphoric meanings, and how those meanings are expressed in grammatical constructions, such as, for instance, Alice Degnan's study here. She demonstrated that metaphoric and literal usage of a word show distinct grammatical behavior. So there is interaction between how different meaning of a word is expressed by distinct grammatical construction, such as different word classes, different inflection, and also different syntactic patterning. Carrie Sullivan did study that reveals the constructional constraints or principle on how we can interpret elements of grammatical construction that can be understood metaphorically and literally. Yeah, so she found certain principles that is predictable from grammatical construction that, okay, this part of the construction will be interpreted metaphorically in metaphoric expression. That's a revealing study from Sullivan. And then Sokolova looks at Russian locative alternation verb and how the metaphoric extension of those verbs not only involve distinct collocates of the verb, but also it involves structural change. So there is different construction in expressing different metaphoric extension of the locative alternation verb in Russian. Another related study is recent work on dative alternation in Dutch by Sarah Bernolet and Timothy Coleman. So they found that dative alternation represent alternation between double object construction, like I give you my money, versus preposition dative construction, like I give the money to you. And they found out that for given verb, different sense of that same verb can exhibit bias towards those two alternations. So one sense of a verb may prefer to occur in the transitive construction, while the other sense of the same verb tend to occur in the preposition dative construction. And before this study, there is a work by Stefan Gries and Anatol Stefanovic that looks at frequency effect in voice construction. What this means is that for a given verb, there is statistical tendency for that verb to occur more frequently in one voice type, like in active, but not in the passive. And this is also found in McDonald's study in 2016 on Austronesian language in North Sumatra in Indonesia. And with this finding, McDonald then suggests that there could be semantic properties of the verbal roots that may account for the strong preference of that verb to occur in active voice, but not in the passive. But this semantic properties aspect has not yet been uncovered. So we try to build on this argument in this study, looking at the semantic properties, in this case, different senses of the same verb in different voice. And this is, I think, closely related to what we try to prove in this study, what we try to test, namely distinct senses of the same verb may indeed display different alternation bias. And this alternation is shown to be in effect in dative alternation, and we want to test that in voice alternation as well. So from the meaning preserving hypothesis, it is expected that all senses, whatever senses a verb can have, should enter or is possible to enter active and passive voice alternation. But as we have shown in recent work that we will see towards the end of this talk, this is not always the case. Okay, and then from the usage-based perspective, we will expect that voice alternation will exhibit bias as in dative alternation or Russian locative alternation. namely different senses of the verb would show strong preference toward one voice type but not the other. And we hope that this may expand works on semantics and grammar interaction, and also test McDonald's semantic properties hypothesis and also sense sensitivity hypothesis that is proposed by Bernoulli and Coleman. Right, that's conceptually speaking for the assumption. And quantitatively, we would expect, the null hypothesis is that the different senses of the same verb would have equal distribution across voice type. Okay, the frequency may not be different, but our alternative hypothesis would be that frequency of a given sense of a given verb would differ as a function of the voice types in which that verb occurs. So we hope to see so-called maybe statistical association between a given voice type of the verb, the form, and a certain sense of the verb, the meaning. Yeah, we hope to see form-meaning relationship here. All right. So we use data from corpora and also sentence production experiment, sentence production task. So for the corpora, we look at 4 files of the Indonesian Leipzig corpora, especially the shuffled sentences from online news that amounts to over 53 million word tokens. And then the target verbs is the derived transitive verbs of forward and backward motion verbs based on this intransitive base or roots, whatever you call it. So this is the forward motion verbs, and aju here is a bound morpheme that cannot occur in itself to be a predicate or a verb. Maju is intransitive, mundur is also intransitive. Undur is listed as intransitive in the dictionary, but we found uses of undur as transitive verb as well. So technically, we look at transitive cause forward and backward motion verbs because this suffix can here, when it is attached to this intransitive verb, it expresses causative sense most of the time. And a little bit of history here. So aju is a reflex of the old Austronesian atu, meaning forward, onward, or towards the hearer. And maju is historically related to aju via derivation of this archaic middle prefix ma. And similar root happens to undur and mundur. Okay, so we thank the anonymous reviewer from Linguistics Vanguard for this information. All right, so we have this base form with kan and without kan for undur. And we didn't take into account aju. As you see, it never occurs in passive D, and when it occurs in mon, they are all typos actually. So we randomly sample 100 concordance lines from these tokens, okay, for each of these base in active and passive clause. And this is just a graph from this table. And we can see clearly there is bias of frequency of this base to occur in different voice. Like for instance, undur more frequently used in passive D, but not in the active. And undurkan, the suffix form of undur, nearly 100% occurs in the active. And we will see later on why this is the case. And the sentence production task is done during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we didn't meet the person, but we sent out the questionnaire to over 200 undergrad students in our department in exchange of for course credit. They all speak Indonesian, okay? And what they need to do in the questionnaire is that they are prompted to produce one sentence using a given target verb that we intersperse, that we put randomly within other filler words. In total, so the participant would produce 34 sentences, one for each of the 34 words. And we didn't tell them why they need to write a sentence. They just need to write the sentence in the sense that, and we told them that we want to know your knowledge about Indonesian language. Only 118 participants responded to the questionnaire, and this allows us to generate a random 100 samples of sentences as similar to the corpus data. All right, and then the concordance then is, and the concordance from the corpus and also the sentences from the elicitation tags are coded for their literal and metaphorical usage. And the literal usage will be coded if the verb refers to physical motions of concrete object. Otherwise, they are coded as metaphorical. And then the distinct senses of the different of the verbs will be inferred from semantic reference of the collocates of the verbs, and that we use to distinguish the distinct senses of the verb. And we also consult the dictionary as guidance. Okay, right. For instance, this example 6 and 7. Example 6 illustrate the physical literal sense of move backward, because this refers to physical motions of a concrete object, car, while here example 7 suggests the metaphorical progressing sense of move forward, because the abstract object here, education. Yeah, education doesn't need to change location so that this sentence to be true. So this is metaphorical usage of majukan. And then we compare the distribution of the different senses of those verbs across active and passive, check for significance using chi-square or Fisher-Exact when the chi-square assumption is not met, like low frequency and low expected frequency. And we also compute effect size, not only significance. And we visualize the association between form and meaning using association plot. Okay, so far I start at 2.2, 16 minutes talk. So I come to the result now. Let's look at this majukan first in active meng and passive D. Okay, this, if I play this, I don't know, maybe it's shown, maybe not. I will just play like this. So if we see from these two graphs, the corpus results and the sentence production results, we see that the color coding indicates different senses, and the x-axis indicates voice. The y-axis here on the vertical axis indicates percentages. And we see from this graph that different senses have different distribution across voice. Like the progressing sense of majukan is strongly overrepresented in the active, but not in the passive. In contrast, the temporal sense of majukan is strongly overrepresented in the passive, but not in the active. Right, and participants show similar tendency for how they use this verb in active and passive. So we found a significant and large difference on how these senses are distributed across voice, and we found convergence between different data types here. So this may suggest that speaker stores detailed usage of these verbs, can not only storing general rule on how they can create active and passive, but they know for this specific verb, it is used for this sense in the active proportionally more often than in the passive. Okay, right. So we see the bias as what Bernoulli and Coleman showed with dative alternation before. Okay, and this is the example of the proposing and putting forward sense of majukan that we haven't seen before. And what is interesting here is that the literal sense is not produced in the corpus, but it is produced in the sentence production data. And if we look at the association plot, this is association plot for the distribution of these senses across voice. We see that the blue rising bar here indicates positive association for this advancing sense and the active voice in both corpus and sentence production data, and the temporal sense is associated with the passive. Okay, yeah, convergence for how the meanings and the form is represented in the corpus and in the speaker's linguistic knowledge of this verb. Let's move back to mundurkan, cause to move backward. So for mundurkan in the corpus, we didn't find significant difference, okay, for the distribution of these senses across voice. And if we see in active and passive voice of this verb, the most frequent sense is the postponed sense. Yeah. So we could say that mundurkan shows meaning-preserving phenomenon or feature in the corpus sample that we analyze. Okay, and but in the sentence production data, there is different picture emerges here. So there is significant difference for the distribution of these senses: postpone, withdraw someone from a position, deteriorate or deprogressing sense, and the literal sense. This literal sense is strongly preferred in the active voice, while the postponed sense is preferred in the passive, which resemble this data here. So we find what we call as divergence between different data types. And the association plot suggests there is no strong preference of these senses towards this voice, as indicated by this gray shaded box. And in the sentence production data association plot, we see relatively strong preference of postpone in the passive, but not in the active. And the literal sense is preferred in the active, but not in the passive. So there is bias of how this sense is expressed in particular voice. This is the sense, examples for this sense: withdraw someone from a position or structural position, change someone's minds or retreat someone from doing their intention, and also deteriorate or deprogressing sense of this verb. Okay, right. So far we've seen how different data type converts towards a significant distributional difference, but there are also divergence in this verb. Okay. If we look at ajukan here, this base in active and passive, ajukan doesn't show any meaning variation, and it only conveys its first and primary sense in the Indonesian dictionary, which is already abstract, metaphorical, and the second sense is listed as the physical sense. That could be remnant of this old Indonesian morpheme atu. So in corpus and sentence production data, there is no difference in the distribution of the meaning. So ajukan could be said as meaning preserving, okay, in a way. So we don't talk about this again here. And if we look at undur now, move backward in active and passive, it is listed as intransitive verb, as I've said before, but it can also occur in transitive syntax without this suffix. Okay, we see for undur, there is no meaning variation like the move backward before. It only expressed postpone in both corpus and sentence production data. So this suggests that this meaning is dominant for this verb in the corpus and also in the speaker's knowledge of this verb. And the significantly different distribution of this sense across passive and active, maybe because we see that the tokens for the passive compared to the active is much more frequent for this verb in the data. And we've seen when we have a relatively balanced sample from sentence production, there is no significant difference between these senses. So we could say that this is a meaning preserving phenomenon for this verb. Okay, this is the last base, undurkan, cause to move backward. Here we see again bias, significant bias, and also large difference in how these senses are distributed across voice. Well, this should be a surprise if I can play these slides. So the strong preference of the sense of cause someone to step down or resign from a position is due to the highly frequent and fixed expression mengundurkan diri. As a whole, this phrase, verb phrase means to resign, to cause yourself to move backward, resign. And this fixed expression only occurs in the active form. So that's maybe the reason why this sense is preferred in the active, because of this fixed expression. And the postponed sense is, again, like before, the temporal sense is preferred in the passive, and both in sentence production and in the corpus data. Okay, so we see from the association plot strong preference of temporal sense in the passive in both data types, and in the sentence production data, this represents strong preference of the cause yourself to resign from your position. Okay, those are the results for each specific verb. And if we take a step back and take a broader look for the results, we see parallelism across words, across these words, for the interconnection of passive D, passive form, and the temporal sense of this verb. So across all of this configuration here, the frequency of temporal sense in the passive is more frequent compared to the active form. Okay, and 6 of this distribution are significant with moderate and large difference. Okay, so there is no random association between this sense with the passive form of this verb in this data that we have. Okay, as a discussion, so I've talked about for 26 minutes now. So if we look at the meaning preserving hypothesis again, and also the voice alternation, if we talk about this hypothesis categorically, it holds. Yeah, so categorically speaking, different senses that we have seen for each verb can indeed occur in different voice. But when we take a usage-based and quantitative approach, there is dynamics that we try to highlight here for the hypothesis that is not predicted by the hypothesis alone. Namely, there is statistical propensity of a given sense to be expressed in a given voice type. And this may not be surprising given what previous work has shown on different alternation types, such as dative alternation and also locative alternation. And this also suggests that the expression of different senses of a verb not only involve or based on distinct collocates of that verbs in those different senses, but also involve distinct morphological voice construction in this case, as we have seen before in the interconnection between temporal and passive form of the studied basis. And we also found convergence, some convergence across different data types between corpus and elicitation data. Okay, so if we go back to this statement from McDonald's and also Bernard and Coleman, we can again make assumption that yes, a given sense of a verb may motivate the preference of that verb to occur in particular voice type in comparison to the other. So such that if we found that a particular verb is more frequent towards particular voice in a certain discourse or in a certain corpus, maybe that verb is used in a sense that prefers to be expressed in that voice type. Yeah, that's another question that needs to be tested again. But we did find bias for certain senses towards certain voice type, as suggested for the dative alternation before. And what our study has shown for some bases is that passive construction may have distinct semantic preference than the active. Again, this is not surprising from construction grammar perspective. And broadly speaking, we hope to show, again, another interaction of constructions and metaphoric meanings of words in language. And I've said before that meaning preserving hypothesis does not always hold for every sense of the verb. So not all sense of the verb is preserved or enter voice alternations. Like, for instance, this data from this verb kenai, from the root kena, get hit. We see that this physical literal sense of physical touch or contact can indeed occur in both construction, but of course it is strongly preferred in the active. And if we see this metaphoric meaning of imposing a regulation or subject to particular regulation, it only and is the most frequent in the passive without any occurrence in the active. So it suggests that this sense is not necessarily derived from the active because we didn't find evidence for this sense in the active form. And it also suggests that this sense can be directly constructed in the passive and may point to the evidence for morphological constructions in construction morphology framework. And if we look at this result from construction grammar perspective, we can discuss this in terms of frequency effects and its impact on how speakers store their linguistic knowledge in their cognitive system. So the strong occurrence of a given sense to occur in a given voice constructions may lead to the conventionalization and also automatization of that sense to be expressed in that form, and how those automatization and also conventionalization may also appear in processing and also production of the verb that we study. And we have looked at one side of these two aspects, the production data, and we found some evidence for convergence between how the verb is used in certain meaning, certain voice in the corpus and sentence production data that may point to the storage of detailed semantics and statistical association of the given verb in a given voice type and the predominant sense that that verb conveys in that particular voice type. And this may also support the argument of item-specific knowledge in construction grammar, where speaker is not only or may not only store the general rule of the language, but also the detailed knowledge of how specific item like certain verb that we analyze here is used in language. Okay, as a summary, so we hope to show the dynamics and nuance of the meaning preserving hypothesis in voice alternation, such that there is a bias of certain senses toward particular voice in comparison to the other voice. And we suggest that voice alternations should be relativized towards the senses of the verb in probabilistic terms, so not be viewed as categorical alternation. This meaning can be expressed in active and passive, but it is more frequently expressed in the active and passive. And we also show that voice alternation does not always retain meaning from this graph. Okay, and we found some convergence between corpus data and sentence production experiment that may point to strong representation of item-specific knowledge as part of what we know when we know language. And the divergence that we found is not surprising because, as Eva Dabrowska says here, the patterns that we found in corpora need not necessarily reflect what speakers store in their linguistic knowledge in the mind. So corpus data and sentence elicitation tasks are grounded in quite different but still valid linguistic realities, and each data type has its own merit to be looked at. So with that, I will stop here, 33 minutes talk, and I would like to thank this individual and institution for their feedback to our research. So looking forward to your feedback as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gede. Just 35 minutes for the presentation. Very nice. Do we have questions? Okay, one question from Carlina. Carlina, go ahead.
Hi, Gede. Thank you very much for a very interesting and nice talk. So my question is, when you try to compare the corpus and the questionnaire, and if you go back to slide 34, in which you did not find the strong preference in the corpus, could it be the reason, could it be because you're taking only 100 of the random sampling data? I mean, if you expand that into more than 100, then could it be the case you might find some preference or some pattern, maybe?
Oh, this one, maybe. Thank you, by the way, Carlina, for the question. So is it the slide that you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So I think if we expand this sample, of course, it will find significance different, I'm sure, at least for this sentence production data. But what I would like to highlight here is that what we found here is that in the corpus, the most frequent sense in both active and passive is the postponed sense of this verb. But what also is surprising for me is why do speaker dominantly the participant produce the literal sense in the active voice in sentence production, but not why the postponed sense in the active? That's another question. So I think if we inflate or increase the sample of the corpus, maybe we find significant association in this plot. I'm sure, but I haven't checked that. But with and if we look at undurkan here, is it undurkan? Yeah, okay, undurkan. Mundurkan. Oh, sorry, it's mundurkan. If we see the frequency of mundurkan here cannot be over 100, only 94 across active and passive in a 53 million words corpus. So I think if we look at mundurkan from more corpus to get over 100, maybe we can find coloring here to see to show a strong preference, but I haven't checked that. But at least from this data, it's surprising that the postponed sense is preferred in both active and passive, but not in here. So there is, I think there is something that is different from what maybe participants have for the use of this verb, but what the speaker does in the corpus when they use this verb. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but if we inflate the corpus sample, I'm sure it will give some significant.
Yeah, I might think of different hypotheses with regard to this size of the corpus. I think it is less likely for the data to show significance preference and significance different, because if you see on the corpus there, it's quite obvious that the number of the tokens are very yeah, they're not yeah, I mean the number of tokens are very, like they have big gap between the senses of postpone, between each sentence and each voice alternation. And if you expand, maybe you might more tokens or more times, but changing the no significance different to the significant different, yeah, I don't know, my hypothesis and my feeling will say that, yeah, although you might expand that to the larger corpus data, maybe it will be less likely to find a strong preference, or at least to this different significant, but you can try maybe. And I continue to the next question, Mas.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if you find this kind of divergence, Gede, which one would you trust more and rely more? Whether you will say that the corpus is more reliable or the sentence production questionnaire is more reliable?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. My take on that is that we will take everything as empirical data. So as in the last slides, I think I mentioned that corpus data would represent different reality than what speaker have in their mind. Maybe because this is maybe because the genre is restricted to the news, and also what speaker experience when they hear or see how this verb is used maybe also different. Maybe they rarely see mundurkan is used with postponed sense in their daily life, but they more often hear mundurkan is used in the more physical sense in their daily life. Maybe that's make the different entrancements of this sense in certain form. And of course, there is an interesting data that I haven't presented here, is that the collocates of mundurkan in sentence production data is interesting because most of the objects are vehicles. So they provide sentences like someone caused the car to move backward. so most of the participants generate that kind of sentence. So maybe they know or they experience more of moving vehicle backward to do some parking or to let other cars move and so on. So I think that kind of experience may impact how they store this verb in their linguistic knowledge. And then the corpus data may what we call may use this verb for different function. I think talking about time is more maybe relevant in news or something like that, rather than talking about moving the car backwards. So I think I would take these two data as both reliable in their own world, in their different realities. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Do we have other questions? Questions? Anyone? So Gede, in your presentation, you quoted some references and they use different terms for active and passive. I think active and passive is the most popular terms, but I think Cole, or I can't recall exactly who you quote, use agentive and passive.
Yeah.
Terms.
Right.
That's more or less similar, right? And I think in different references, they use like subject-oriented and object-oriented sentences as well. So for those who are seeing the presentation, they are quite similar, right?
Yeah. So let me share the screen. I think this is from Brad McDonald's study. So yeah, because McDonald's look at this symmetrical voice, the underscore voice, and also the agentive voice. So he used this term, but the idea is the same in the agentive voice construction. The agent is the syntactic subject, but in the passive voice construction, it is the undergoer that is the subject. So I think he used the same different terms, but with similar concept of the alignment of grammatical relations and semantic roles. Yeah.
Karina, go ahead. Another question?
Yeah, I mean, if there is someone else who wants to ask the question, then maybe you could give the turn to that person first. Okay, so no, yeah. Another question, Gede. I'm so sorry because yeah, your data is interesting and your questionnaire, that's something that I would like to do as well for my further research. And in your questionnaire, you're saying about the sentence production, and I wonder if you are also taking into account to their sentence perception. I mean, if you classify that a word is called postpone, then in the preceding questionnaire or inside the questionnaire, did you also ask to the participant whether they understand the word of the meaning in a sentence context as the postpone? I mean, it's just to cross-validate whether your understanding is also what the participant understands and try to convey their sentence production.
Yeah, that's interesting question, I think. Well, the simple question is no. I didn't check them whether they understand. But the thing is, we only ask or instruct them, please write a sentence using this verb, using this word. I don't use verb because there are also non-verb words. But from the collocational context in the sentence that they produce, I can tell that, they intend to express postponed sense for, let's say, majukan, because like ujian, the examination is move forward, the meeting is move forward. So from those group of semantically similar collocates, like event types of collocates, we can guess that this is intended to be the postponed sense. And when they start using move forward the education, move forward the economy, all of those abstract senses, we understand that they may convey the progressing sense of cause object to move forward. So, but well, yeah, I think it's good to later on check what they means by this. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. But we because I learned this from John, so we just want to get a spontaneous reaction from participant, what they would produce when they are faced with that verb in front of them.
Yeah.
But that's a good point, I think, Karina.
And that's a nice way for the human experiment in the questionnaire. Yeah, thanks for the idea. Okay.
Okay, no problem. I should say thank you to John actually to introduce me to this method. Simple but very, I think, revealing in a way.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And actually, I had similar thought with Carolina because I had a paper written and published, and I used the same method like Gede, like doing corpus experiment and also sentence production. But after the paper was published, I asked myself the same question like Carolina. Okay, so when I ask them to write a sentence like this, do they really understand what they're writing, or they just want to finish the questionnaire as soon as possible? Yeah. Because I see in one of your slides, the number of mengundur is quite a lot. I can't recall exactly which number. So if you can open your presentation slide again on sentence production, which compare mengundur and diundur, if I recall it correctly.
Is it the this one? This one?
Yes, that one. So sentence production, so mengundur and diundur, so they are almost the same, 75 for mengundur. But for me, introspectively, I have never used this word, mengundur. Diundur, yes, I use it quite frequently. Right. So I'm wondering in what context they use this this verb.
Yeah, I think they use this in the context of mengundur meeting, mengundur examination, and so on. So I think I can, but
yeah, it is interesting if we can see like in what kind of sentence they create using.
Let me clear up the
or maybe from the corpus data, even from corpus data, it can be interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think the good point here is that you have no intuition about mengundur in active, and yeah, this is maybe because they need to write a sentence in active, so they produce this sentence. That's right. I think that's the reason. But if we look at the natural data, like how undur is used in the corpus,
it also exists.
It exists, but you see,
it exists. Yeah, it's quite surprising too for me. Yeah.
But this actually maybe matches your intuition so that's why mengundur is very low in frequency in the corpus. If we see the raw frequency of undur in the passive, only 45, okay, in the corpus, and over nearly 400 in the passive in the corpus. So this already suggests discrepancy on how this base is predominantly used in certain morphological form. And maybe it matches your intuition about the less predominant use of undur in active voice. So that's actually a good point. But really, when the participant produce undur in active voice here, it is in the context of postponing a meeting, exam, event, and so on. And as I've said, there is no other sense of undur in sentence production other than postpone. So they don't say mengundur the car. They never say that, only in abstract sense like this. So that's why there is no meaning variation, and the distribution of this sense across active and passive are nearly equal. And that's because it's just meaning preserving, I think, for this inactive and passive. And the significant difference that we found here is just the artifact of the corpus, that simply the active voice form of undur is less frequent, less than 100, compared to the passive D form of undur, which if we sample randomly 100, we retrieve 100, and 100 is significantly more frequent than 45, according to this test. So I think, I don't know, is that answer to your question. I think that's a comment that it matches your intuition, at least for the corpus. The production of active voice undur here in sentence production, I think maybe it's because they need to write sentence in this form. So we get this number.
Yeah.
I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, do we have another question? You can also write in the chat box if you cannot use microphone. We can see the chat box clearly. No? Right, and also you mentioned about underscore voice. So maybe this is quite uncommon for maybe for English speakers, I don't know. Even for Indonesian speaker, I think in our school we were just taught the tradition of active and passive voice, but there is a construction of this underscore voice. And you mentioned that this is the remnants of Austronesian languages.
Yeah, it's like a feature. I mean, one of the key feature that distinguish Austronesian and other language family, like especially like English, because underscore voice is quite prominent in Austronesian literature on voice, because this voice shows the feature of passive, but it is not passive. And this voice is also morphologically unmarked, first of all. And then like passive, here, the undergoer fills the syntactic subject according to the literature. Okay, this is the syntactic subject, and it is like passive because the undergoer fills the syntactic subject. But unlike passive, where in true passive, the actor argument is optional, we can omit the actor argument. In the undergoer voice, the actor is still obligatory. It's like, is it a passive or it is not? So that's why this term is coined by the scholars. And because of this core status of this actor argument, this undergoer voice is transitive syntactically, unlike the true passive, which is intransitive because the core argument is only the patient and the agent is optional. So that's the intransitive situation in the true passive. Yeah, and yeah, I think that's about it for the underscore voice. I think I'm not that expert on this system, but this is the feature that we have in Indonesian and in Balinese. I'm not sure in other languages. I think it has this feature in also North Sumatra that McDonald studied. And we see here the English gloss is made like this. The celebration, we move it forward one day. So it's not translated into a passive form.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that we can use underscore voice with the verb mengundur? No?
Mengundur.
Perayaannya kita undur. No, right. So without prefix.
Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah. Okay.
That meeting itu kita undur. That meeting we move backward. I think we could. But if we check the frequency of the unprefix form of undur, there is certain amount of frequency, 56. So it can appear in the underscore voice from this data. But
it will be interesting to investigate whether they occur in that data.
Yeah, so we excluded this from the study because the frequency is very low, and at some point the unprefix form is also representing the informal version of the monk. So usually in the news title they just write the base like this, but the intention is not the underscore voice but the active voice without the prefix. Right. So that's the majority of the unprefix form of this verb. Yeah.
All right. So I think there's no more question, and we have only 4 minutes. So I think we just call it a day. Thank you very much, Gede, for giving the talk. I believe there might be more questions, but we are scheduled only for an hour, and I do not want to prolong the session any longer. because due to the time difference, it must already be very late in where Gede is now. So if you still have questions, maybe after this, you have a look at the presentation slide, ask more questions, and you can email him, and his email is available on his slides, first slides, and downloadable via UCREL webpage. Right, so I'm going to end the recording here. Let me stop the recording.
So yeah, thank you.